Hey, so a really warm welcome to everyone this evening. It's really delightful to see you all here. And as you know, this is our last online event for 2023. And I think it's quite appropriate that we have Dr. Sebastjan Vörös, who will be speaking to us about one of our core, really our core, not just themes, but characters at Mind and Life Europe, which is Francisco Varela and his entire intellectual legacy. So Sebastjan, this evening, he'll be giving a talk entitled Intimate Distances, Reflections About and with Francisco Varela. And before I hand the floor over to you, Seb, I'm just like to briefly introduce and give a little bit of a bio, so we have more about your background for those who don't know you and your work. So Sebastjan Vörös is an associate professor of philosophy in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. His research interests encompass philosophy of science, epistemology, phenomenology, and philosophy of religion. He's the author of The Images of the Unimaginable from the University of Ljubljana Press in 2013 and 2015, in which he investigates the phenomenon of mystical experiences from neuroscientific, phenomenological, and gnosiological perspectives. He has co-edited numerous articles and special issues centered on embodiment and action and neurophenomenology, with a special emphasis on Francisco Varela's contributions to these fields. Also, he has translated several important philosophical texts into Slovene, in addition to works by Antonio Damasio, Daniel Dennett, Williams James, and Alfred North Whitehead. Sebastjan has also translated and edited The Embodied Mind by, of course, Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Roche. Finally, he is the head of the Transdisciplinary Institute in the Making called Metanoia, and is currently writing a book on the philosophical and scientific work of Francisco Varela. So thank you so much, Seb, for offering really your window onto the world of Francisco Varela, not just his intellectual work, but also his life and his person. I think we're all really, really looking forward to your talk this evening. And of course, this is an MLE Friends talk. And so it's nice to have just a small community of friends to have an in-depth discussion in the second part of the evening. So I will hand the floor to you, Seb.
So yeah, thank you very much for this lovely introduction, and hello to everyone who has joined us today. Before I start with my presentation, just a brief intro. I was just explaining this before, but with this particular presentation, something strange happened. This has never happened to my presentations before. Namely, I really had the problem of getting this one off the ground, so to speak. So what happened is that after some days of struggling with how do I start this? How do I put these things together? A text started emerging. And you don't have to worry, I'm not going to read the whole thing out for 1 hour, but I'm going to use it as a foundation. And this is going to be the first time I'll be doing this in my lectures. I've never, ever read anything while doing it. So it'll be a bit of a combination. So just so you know, yeah. I will now share my screen and hopefully everything will work from the very get-go. Now somebody, preferably yes, Gabor, will show me that the thing is working. Okay, so let's begin. I was invited to give a talk about my current work, which, as many of you know, revolves mostly around the life and thought of Francisco Varela. However, I was also asked not just to talk about the object of my work, that is to say, but the subject of inquiry that I'm mostly interested in, but also to talk a little bit about the subject doing the research itself, which is myself, who is myself. This to me is a somewhat thankless task, I have to say, not only because I find it quite difficult to talk about myself. There are just so many far more captivating topics out there, but also because it is a task beset with many pitfalls. It is namely all too easy to slip into one of the two extremes. On the one hand, one can easily slip into unwarranted self-praise. So what happens is there's this ongoing emphasis on me, which overshadows the subject matter that is being discussed. that is to say, in this particular case, Francisco. On the other hand, there are these lackluster template autobiographies, which are merely formal generic backdrops and don't really add anything to the story, so they could be easily dropped. Both of these extremes often contribute little to nothing to the understanding of the topic. So the way I decided to structure my talk is to divide it into two parts. And hopefully in doing so, I'll be avoiding both the extreme of self-adulation and anemic formalism. So I will start with my own personal encounter with Francisco's work. I will try to show how his work entered my life, and above all, why I found it so important. Important not only on the level of ideas, of different concepts, different theories, but even more so for introducing me into a distinct thought style or the distinct habit or mode of thought. I will say more on this later on. And in the second part, I will try to flesh out, spell out this style of thought or the broader background or horizon in which Francisco's thought is rooted. I will try to do this next step, the second step, in two subsequent steps. So first, the first step will be more historical or biographical in nature. I will focus on Francisco's experience with coup in Chile and his insight that he had in the importance of the epistemological frameworks as he understands them. I will again explain what this means later on. The second step will be more theoretical and philosophical in nature. So I will focus on what I here refer to as Francisco's broader philosophical project. And this will include the attempt to revitalize life, revitalize vitality, and to develop what he called participatory epistemology. Now, if all goes well, if I don't mess up somewhere, half of the talk should be dedicated to more personal and biographical topics. Half of the talk should be dedicated to theoretical ideational topics. So everybody ideally should find something of interest in this talk. However, this wouldn't be a proper Varelian talk if there weren't a Varelian twist to it. So throughout the presentation, I will try to show how these two aspects that I've just described feed into each other, how they interrelate. More specifically, I will try to show what it was that motivated me to pursue my research in Francisco, and then how that specific angle, that specific motivation contributed to my unearthing and underscoring certain aspects in Francisco's work that usually don't get that much attention. These aspects, these more hidden aspects, so to speak, when properly thematized, have then allowed me to articulate some of my own fragmentary insights and intimations better, and so on, in what seems like a hopefully virtuous, that is to say, fruitful circle, not a vicious one. Okay, let us then start with the first part, my personal encounter with Francisco's work. Our story here begins more than 20 years ago, when I have found myself in a pretty dark place. In the middle of what you might call my own personal dark night of the soul, to use the evocative phrase coined by one of my favorite Christian mystics, St. John of the Cross. Now, the reasons and the specifics as to why I found myself in this particular place are irrelevant for our topic. The crucial thing is the huge and profoundly transformative impact it had on me. Back then, I was still a student, and I was a fairly prototypical young intellectual in the making. This means that I considered myself to be an extremely open-minded, liberal, unburdened by prejudice and tradition, whereas in fact, although I wouldn't admit it then, regardless of how much you tortured me, I was very much a product of my times and my milieu. If I exaggerate a little bit, I can say that I was an algorithm spewing forth ideas that were in line with the sensibilities of the various groups I was part of, young intellectuals, artists, and so on and so forth. Now, what is especially important for our talk is that back then I had a rather naive scientific or even scientific view of the world. Science, in my view, was the measure of all things. It knew how things worked, it knew how things changed, how they evolved, and so on and so forth. I had little patience with other dimensions of existence, especially with topics that were related to religion or certain domains or dimensions of humanities. Science or scientism seemed to me to be the only worldview an intellectually honest person could adopt, and one that provided a much needed counterweight to the oppressive obscurantisms of the past. Well, then at some point I was visited by the dark night, and very quickly all this became undone. One of the more poignant realizations during this dark time, a realization that made the whole affair particularly bleak, was that I possessed no tools, no means to effectively or meaningfully cope with my situation. I had no conceptual frameworks, no practical strategies, nothing. The conceptual or ideational structures at my disposal proved more or less futile. They could offer nothing of substance, nothing that would help me understand or make sense of what was transpiring. This has impressed itself particularly strongly on my mind during what, to an outside observer, may seem like a trivial, but for me turned out to be a crucial incident in this ordeal. During these bleak or dreary times, I would take long solitary walks in a small nearby forest. It was in the middle of the winter, often there was a lot of snow. The forest would be mostly empty and I could roam freely, undisturbed by other people, and during that time, my heart was craving solitude. One particularly cold day, I would, exhausted by what seemed like a whirlwind of barren reflections, end up sitting on a snow-covered bench in front of a tree. My only wish at this particular point was to simply sit there and observe the tree, or better yet, observe myself observing the tree. Merely that and nothing more, as the poet says. However, much to my dismay, I soon realized that I couldn't do it. A simple task as that, yet completely out of my reach. For some reason, something in me permanently shifted or broke at that moment. The experience proved to be a magisterial lesson in humility, and it showed me how utterly clueless I was about everything, about the world, myself, literally everything. For the first time, I became aware, viscerally aware, that I inhabited an ideational horizon or a framework, and that all my various thoughts, all these seemingly elaborate, diverse mental constructs, were merely permutations of the same, configurations and reconfigurations within the same framework, within the same context, within the same field. I further realized two additional things. First, how little this context had to offer when push came to shove, when it came to the bare, in-your-face givens or rhythms of existence. Second, that this way of looking, this way of thinking, was not even my own, so to speak, that it was something that I absorbed through some sort of intellectual osmosis during all these years of upbringing, education, and so on and so forth, but I had no key, no understanding of. Yes, it was all intellectually intriguing, all intellectually stimulating, but it seemed completely divested from the rawness and vibrancy of the existential drama that was unfolding in front of me, or better yet, through me. However, there's a flip side to this story. As the poet Hölderlin puts it, but where the danger is, grows the saving power also. Although I didn't know it at the time, the experience in the forest sowed the seed of important transformative insight. Note that the maturing of this insight didn't happen instantaneously. Quite the contrary, the realization that started dawning upon me back then, through a glass darkly, needed several years, even decades, to be digested and articulated properly. And in fact, it is still something that I'm working on. Anyway, eventually spring came and I found my way out of the dark night. But I came out a different man, above all a homeless, groundless man. The experience and incipient insight left me bereft of not only intellectual, but also, and fundamentally, of my existential shelter. This all-pervading sense of groundlessness resulted in hunger. I started devouring books on philosophy, history, science, and theology. And one of the books, not the only one, mind you, but definitely one of the more important ones that came to me during this time was The Embodied Mind, that I'm sure you all know very well. The Embodied Mind proved to be particularly important for me for two main reasons. First of all, it had a very direct, very immediate impact on me. So my eclectic, erratic explorations that I've just described led me to many fascinating discoveries. Yet I couldn't really shake off the impression that when I was moving from, say, philosophy to science to history to theology and back again, I was jumping from one ideational island to another, each fascinating in its own right, true, but with little connection between them. Embodied Mind showed me how to build tentative, or as Francisco puts it, gentle bridges between these seemingly disparate ideational islands. However, and this is even more important for our talk, Embodied Mind also had an indirect, more long-lasting impact. Namely, it had an impact that was somehow much more diffuse and spread out. It introduced into my life a hint or a vague promise of something more, of something that I was unable to clearly latch onto, but that was already foreshadowed in this first encounter. Something that I felt that could help me better understand and articulate what I intimated in that wintry forest. As I learned later, this more, this beyond, had to do with the broader horizon in which Francisco developed his ideas. The horizon which, while it was not clearly spelled out in any one of Francisco's works, but rather had to be elucidated from various bits and pieces and then mulled over and verbalized, was at the same time essential to properly understand the significance of Francisco's central concepts. Concepts such as autonomy, autopoiesis, enaction, and many, so all the concepts that we normally associate Francisco with. And it is this horizon, this more, this beyond, this background context that I want to talk to you in the second part of my talk. So now we're leaving the personal dark nights and similar topics and moving to the second part, to Francisco's work. Okay, so one thing that is characteristic of Francisco's work, and that anybody who has ever tried to study different texts that he wrote in different time periods knows, is that he was a person of many hats. So he had an immense variety of interests, an immense variety of pursuits. His contributions, as we all know, span a wide range of disciplines, from mathematics and logics through biology and cognitive science to phenomenology and contemplative science. And in addition to that, they include a plethora of novel concepts and theories that he either developed or helped develop, so co-developed. Concepts like autonomy, autopoiesis, enaction, neurophenomenology, and so on. Some of them I've already mentioned. Now, many who are present here today probably know the post-enactionist Francisco. That's the Francisco who is usually associated with enaction, neurophenomenology, contemplative science, maybe somewhat to autopoiesis and autonomy. But there are also groups that have the exclusive focus on his work on mathematics and logics. Very interesting, slightly eccentric groups, but small groups, but they are still people who are mostly interested in that. And I've actually met some people who are really, really appreciative of Francisco's work in the field of cybernetics, in the field of autonomy, autonomous systems, but are not particularly enthusiastic about his later work, so the work that has to do with enaction and especially phenomenology. So Francisco, for some, is too much of a cybernetician, for others, he is too much of a phenomenologist, and so on and so forth. Now, the main problem in all of this is that this diversity might lead to unbridled plurality, and consequently, one might lose very easily the forest for the trees. That is to happen. What might occur is that we may get so enamored by a particular topic or a notion or a theory, that we overlook a distinct framework or a context within which the text of these individual ideas unfolds and makes sense. Now, Francisco, especially in his earlier works, refers to this context, this framework or background under the name of epistemology. This is how himself puts it. You see, my basic bias, my fundamental narrow-mindedness is that I don't believe we can talk about a worldview or any representation of what the world is like without at the same time observing and critically examining how these ideas came about. No content should be divorced from where this content has been produced, that is to say, context. This goes under the name of epistemology, and so I would like to do a little epistemology. So what I in turn propose is that we ourselves do a little epistemology on Francisco himself and try to unearth this missing key, this background context of his thought. There are, of course, several ways we could go about doing this. In a way, one might say that Francisco's ideational edifice is like a palace with 1,000 doors, all of which, if followed to the very end, lead to the same innermost chamber. However, I believe that for the purposes of this talk, a particularly good entryway is a lecture that Francisco delivered in 1978 at the Lindisfarne Fellows meeting, and that he published 1 year later under the title Reflections on the Chilean War. This text is available online, and I strongly encourage you to read it if you haven't yet. Let us briefly go through certain parts of the text together. In this essay, Francisco writes how 2 years after the election of Allende's socialist government, the Chilean population became so radically polarized that, not unlike what we're currently witnessing in many Western countries, it literally split into two. In his own words, you could go to the newsstands in the morning and one newspaper would say it's raining, the other would say it's not raining. A is a son of a bitch, A is the king of the world. It was literally like that. Originally a fervent supporter of Allende's government, Francisco started having serious misgivings about the meaningfulness of the whole project. I started, he writes, out being very supportive of the whole thing. But by the second year, I began to have my serious suspicions. I just couldn't believe that the other guys on the other side of the fence were so bad, stupid, wrong, immoral, ugly as I was supposed to believe. There was something that just wasn't jibing anymore. So we have a little bit of a 60s slang here as well. Now, this extreme sociopolitical polarization, as we all know, ultimately escalated in the infamous coup d'etat of 1973 by Augusto Pinochet. Francisco recounts how in those first few days, as the raw reality of the civil war began to assert itself with an increasingly palpable presence, he was struck by a profound sense of disorientation. We know, he says, that the rug has been pulled from under us, that there is no sense in which we know what is happening anymore. For me, at that time, the ground had been pulled from under me. Nothing else was left to hold on to. However, as this sense of groundlessness grew more and more intense, something interesting started to happen. A peculiar form of insight, profound yet difficult to articulate, began to dawn on him. At the same time, a very funny and contrary process happened. As things got more and more chaotic, there was a strange form of clarity coming more and more, a strange form of understanding, which I can't really express. Now, that experience is what I have had to deal with ever since, and it literally turned my life inside out. You can probably understand the sense of amazement I felt when I first read these lines several years after my own experience. Now, literally a decade after my own experience. Although evoked by very different circumstances, it is difficult not to observe the striking parallels between the two experiences. And it should soon become clear how Francisco's insight became directly relevant to my own dealings with the content issue. Anyway, be that as it may, the upshoot of the experience for Francisco was the realization of how the two sides, the two poles, were part of the same dynamics, of the same process, that they were mutually, collectively creating and recreating the framework of division within which this madness was unfolding. In his own words, I could literally see how this whole thing wasn't me here and they there, but something that we had collectively constructed. It dawned on me that whatever my stances or somebody else's opinions had been were fragments that constituted this whole, this complete mandala of sorts, this craziness which I was responsible, everybody was. For Francisco, out of this insight, Francisco drew two main implications, two main consequences out of these, out of this particular experience and the correlative insight. The first implication was that epistemologies matter. This is how he puts it. The Civil War gave me the experience that epistemologies are not something abstract, but create the kind of world that we live in and the kind of human values that we have. As far as I'm concerned, that civil war was caused by a wrong epistemology. So, according to Francisco, epistemologies are not just a matter of scholarly pursuit, but something that feeds into and even determines the worlds in which we live. The second main realization or implication was that we have to be mindful of our epistemologies, our own epistemologies that we are co-creating. Again, in his own words, unless I was able to cut through my sense of attachment and identification with what I believe are my ideas, my things, my territory, my limits, I had no hope of understanding what the hell was going on. We must incorporate in the enactment, in the projecting out of our own worldviews, at the same time the sense in which that projection is only one perspective, that it must contain ways to undo itself. And unless we find a way of creating expressions of that nature, we are going to be constantly going around the same circle. In other words, we have to have an insight into our own frameworks, how they come to be, and how they can be dealt with. That is to say, done and undone and redone skillfully, effectively. Not undone in the absolute sense, for one cannot live without frameworks. To live, we might say, is to inframe, as I will try to elaborate on later on, but with a certain wise, open detachment. Now, before we proceed to the last third of this presentation, the more philosophical one, in a certain sense, this is already the beginning of this particular thing, an intro. A few more words on Francisco's notion of epistemology, because for some of you, it might sound strange that he's talking about epistemologies in this context. Now, clearly, Francisco does not mean epistemology in the sense of what is normally thought in the courses on theory of knowledge, especially in Anglo-American settings. Epistemology in Francisco's sense is not, or at least not exclusively or primarily, a discipline that is studying the possibilities, sources, and scope of knowledge. For this particular notion or this particular understanding of epistemology already presupposes that we know what knowledge is, what it stands for. So, and usually knowledge is understood as something that is general, universal, and given. Francisco, on the other hand, is interested in what it is that counts as knowledge. That is to say, he is interested in the cradle or in the birthplace of a particular type of knowledge, in the overarching horizon of meaning that makes sense for us to grasp something of knowing, to grasp something as knowing, as knowledge, as a particular type of knowing. So in this regard, we might say that Francisco's understanding of epistemology is closer to what, for instance, Kuhn called a paradigm, what Fleck called a thought style, or what Whitehead referred to as the habit of thought. In this sense, there is no one single epistemology, but there are different epistemologies which are permeated by various historical, material, socio-cultural, technological, and so on dimensions. This is an extremely important point, so I would really like us to spend a little bit more time on this. So let's try to approach this from a slightly different angle. When we are investigating a given author, a given system, or a given school of thought, we usually focus on a given worldview. That is to say, on the concepts, on ideas, on arguments and models, and so on and so forth. However, what often gets forgotten here is that each worldview is a viewpoint, that is to say, a point of view. And this point designates a certain situatedness. That is to say, it designates a certain concrete setting, a certain anchorage, a certain perspective out of which we engage with the world. Furthermore, every viewpoint is a standpoint. What do I mean by that? Well, it is not an abstract point in a geometric space, but has a temporal weight, a terrestrial density, you might say. It is embedded in the rhythms of history, culture, technology, and so on and so forth. For instance, you see what you see because you have been taught to engage with things in this and this way because you inhabit a distinct socio-historical world of meaning. So, with what has just been said, we can now flesh out provisionally what Francisco's project could be. And this will be the topic of the last third of my talk. So, the first point, the first step in this particular project would be understanding the prevailing, the predominant context. Where are we? How did we get here? And where are the problems of this particular context? The second step would be recontextualization. That is to say, development of an alternative context that would not only remedy the lacks, the problems of the first predominant context, but that would also allow for a better self-reflection. So this awareness that we actually are in a given context, that is to say, an understanding of our own participation in a given framework. And then the final step would be what I here refer to as contextualization or decontextualization. What do I mean by this? It is an attempt to explore the very process of contextualization, to explore where and how and why contexts are born, where and how and why they change. To explore, in other words, the birthplace or the cradle of contextuality, or to capture contexts in their contextualizing, in their happening, in their occurrence, as they are born. Yeah. So now I would like to take you through these 3 individual steps, and I will briefly try to flesh them out so that we get a feel for this larger horizon, ideational horizon within which Francisco was working. So let us start with the first topic, so context. What is the prevailing, the predominant context? Of course, a whole lecture or a whole series of lectures could be dedicated to this. So this will be a very, very brief account, just enough so to get us by so that we can get to the more crucial aspects of Varela's thought. Francisco used several different names for this particular context. He called it the image of the world, which is a phrase used by Heidegger. He called it a Cartesian program or dictum. He called it objectivist ideology. He even called it a mechanistic observer-free science and philosophy. Now, for brevity's and simplicity's sake, I'll simply refer to it as Cartesianism, as this is also the word he uses, and that is probably quite well known for most of you. Now, immediately, I would just like to underline that, of course, even though it's called Cartesianism, it is not limited solely to Descartes. Instead, it refers to a larger epistemological shift or a rupture that happened in approximately 16th to 18th century and is usually associated with scientific revolution and a distinct thought style that emerged out of it. A lot of weighty books and articles have been written about this particular thought style. And of course, I'm not going to be able to do it justice here. However, I would like to point out 3 main characteristics of this new thought style, especially in how it pertains to a new understanding of nature and knowledge. Now, what are these 3 characteristics that will be important for the rest of our talk? The first is mathematization. Mathematization is the idea or the notion that phenomena can be exhaustively accounted for in mathematical and or formal terms. Mechanization, the next characteristic, is the idea that phenomena ultimately consist of discrete, causally interrelated material constituents, so that the reality fundamentally is built out of spatio-temporal entities that are causally interrelated. And finally, depersonalization, perhaps a slightly strange name, but basically what this is the idea that to know means to exclude the knower, the person doing the knowing. More broadly, we might say that knowing in this conception has to be freed from everything subject or observer related. Now, of course, there are several problems related to this. And again, I will focus only on those that are most important for us. As the famous quote by Shakespeare goes, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. There are, of course, specific aspects and characteristics of nature, of reality, which cannot be accounted in this manner. Which characteristics? Where on the one hand, we have phenomena such as colors, sounds, or textures. But even more importantly, there are such phenomena such as values, norms, and meanings. And these cannot be accounted for in the way that I've just delineated via these three characteristics. Now, what are the consequences of this? I would like to point out two that seem to be most pertinent. One implication of what I've just said is the so-called bifurcation of nature. The second one is the disenchantment of nature. Probably terms that are more or less familiar to you, so I will go briefly through them. What is the bifurcation of nature? It is a term that was used by Alfred North Whitehead, and it basically refers to this idea that with the development of this new Cartesian thought style, nature split into two incommensurable domains, that is to say, domains that do not have a common measure. Put very simply, but hopefully poignantly, we have the domain or the world of experience, which is given, but is not real, is illusory. On the other hand, we have the world of science, which is real, but is not given. So you have access, direct access to the world of experience, yet it is an illusory world. On the other hand, you never have direct access to the world of science, yet this is precisely the real world. The second aspect, the second problematic aspect, is closely related to the first one. So the disenchantment of nature or the disenchantment of reality. This is a term coined by Max Weber, the famous sociologist, and it basically refers to the infamous split between facts and values. The crucial point here is that values, meanings, norms, so all those aspects that make our life meaningful, that give nourishment to our lives, are severed from reality. They appear to have nothing to do with how things are. Instead, they are understood just as our own subjective projections and therefore relative and contingent. But if everything goes, if everything is contingent, then nothing has any value. Nothing truly nourishes, nothing truly feeds, which raises, of course, the very problematic issue, the very problematic paradox of nihilism. Now, these two problems, bifurcation, which is the epistemic issue of this particular thought style, and disenchantment, which is an existential issue related to this Cartesian thought style, lead to the dualisms that most of you or all of you here are very well familiar with. So the infamous dualisms of mind-body, self-others, and above all, self-world. So this is a very brief sketch of the context, of the prevailing context, which we are embedded in and which Varela tries to change, which Francisco tries to overcome and change. So now we're moving to the second step, the recontextualization. This, as I already mentioned, has to do with the development of an alternative context, a context which would be not only able to solve the problems of the Cartesian context, but would also allow us to reflect on our own participation in this particular context. So our own participation in the knowing or the in-framing process. This means that the solution for dualisms, the pernicious dualisms that I've just enlisted, according to Francisco, cannot be found on the level of the content. So it cannot be solved by some sort of a theoretical fix or a conceptual addition. This concretely means, for instance, that we will not be able to solve the mind-body problem by actually digging out a specific solution. Instead, according to Francisco, the problems can only be solved by recontextualizing them. So not solving them actively, not solving them head-on, but dissolving them, so to speak. So by changing the context, changing the framework in which they appear, they prove to be no longer problematic. So the new framework presents phenomena in a way where these problems no longer appear. So according to Francisco, this calls for nothing less than a new non-dualist thought style, a new non-dualist habit of thought. And this thought style, mind you, has to be comprehensive. It needs to dispel both the bifurcation problem and the disenchantment problem. In other words, it is not enough that it's simply a neat intellectual solution. It has to provide both the epistemic and the existential suturing, so bringing together of the world and the observer, so to speak. Yeah? So it has to cover both of these aspects. This new context, this attempt at developing an alternative framework, is sometimes referred in Francisco's text as epistemology of participation or ontological turn. He is not being particularly systematic with these terms, and he uses different terms in different texts, and also he uses them relatively fragmentarily. However, both of these names, so both epistemology of perception and ontological turn, emphasize the closer relation between being and knowing. So this emphasis that my knowing has to be anchored in, that is to say, it has to participate in the world, in the reality. It has to be ontologically rooted. It has to be rooted in being, as the philosophers might say. Put differently, and in line with what I said before, it is a recognition that my viewpoint is anchored in and feeds back into my standpoint. In other words, that how and what I know is related to how and what I am, how I exist. Now, Francisco never provided a systematic and comprehensive account of what this recontextualization should entail. The closest he gets is in a semi-programmatic statement he makes in a very early text from 1976, not one, not two. And we also find some reverberations in his later text, published close to his passing and relatively unknown. In this particular text, in not one, not two, Francisco says that if we want to really change the context, we have to do it truly comprehensively, and that this particular change has to encompass at least 3 dimensions, okay? Recontextualization has to encompass at least 3 dimensions. What are these dimensions? Yes, I apologize. So in his own words, they have to encompass a change in the logic used to understand what dialectics and parts and wholes are. Second, the scientific ideas about what mind is, we have to move away from the brain secretion image, that is to say, the image that mind is secreted by the brain, towards mind as conversational domain, as mind, that is to say, towards mind as something that is interactive, so to speak. And finally, a change in the cultural conception about the mind. That is to say, about the kinds of experience that are socially and individually accessible. Now, if we go through this a little bit systematically, we see that Francisco claims that if we want to achieve a comprehensive change of a context in which we are embedded, in which we live, in which we operate, we have to develop new formal tools, new scientific models, and new what I here refer to as politics or technologies of experience. And I would like to now call your attention to the fact that each of these individual aspects addresses one of the characteristics of the Cartesian thought style. So the formal tools, new formal tools, refers to the aspect of mathematization. New scientific models, aspect of mechanization. So we have to develop models that would talk about life and or mind that would be different from the ones that are used in the mechanical conception of the world. And finally, the question of depersonalization is something that is being addressed by what I here refer to as politics or technologies of experience. And interestingly enough, if you were to go through individual Francisco's works, so go through his texts over time, you would see that they neatly map onto this plan. So he started off by developing novel mathematical tools, non-dual mathematical tools, under the context or the heading of arithmetic of closure and calculus of self-reference. Then he developed new models or new metaphors for life and mind under the heading of autopoiesis, autonomy, and action, natural drift. And finally, in his last years, he was mostly focused on phenomenological topics, neurophenomenological topics, and first-person research, and of course, contemplative science. Okay, so this is the broad picture. Now, the question, of course, that emerges, but what is this axle? What is this hinge around which these three dimensions, these three new conceptions are supposed to turn? So what is the core, the center around which we should develop this new context, this participatory epistemology? And this is where the phenomenon of vitality, phenomenon of life enters the picture. So this is now the last step, and we're slowly moving towards the end of presentation. So I kindly ask you to muster up the last molecules of focus and attention that you can. Yeah. So this last part is the part that will try to explore the paths leading to the birthplace of contextuality. And I will explain what I mean by this. And for Francisco, a crucial non-dualist crack in the edifice of Cartesianism is precisely life or vitality. Now the question is, why did Francisco find life so intriguing, so important? Why did he see it as that central phenomenon around which he could build a novel epistemological framework which would counter the previous one? Primarily, this was the case because, as I would like to argue, the Janus-faced nature of life. Janus, as you know, was a Roman god of beginnings and endings, transitions, doors, and passageways, and it's usually depicted with two heads facing in different directions, back and front. But why and how is life Janus-faced? What do I mean by that? Here I would like to draw your attention to a simple yet very poignant observation that was made by a French phenomenologist, Barbaras. Barbaras said that if we look at the French verb vivre, we see that it can mean two interrelated, closely interrelated things. On the one hand, it can mean to live, but on the other hand, it can also mean to experience. Now, interestingly enough, and I was told that this holds true in the Hungarian language as well, and Gabor can probably verify this, we find a similar parallelism in other languages. For example, in German, we have leben, which means to live, and erleben, which means to experience. In my native tongue, Slovene, of which you have undoubtedly heard a lot of stuff, you have živeti and doživeti. So this interesting interrelation between to live and experience. What this means is that life can refer both to a living body, so to an existence in the world, or in other words, to organisms, but it can also refer to a lived body, that is to say, to experience of the world, or in other words, to the feeling of aliveness, or this fundamental primordial sense of existence, of which de Biran speaks, for instance. Now, as you know, Francisco latched on to this Janus-faced character of life, and he was quite enamored by this dual aspectivity. So by the fact that life is both a living and refers to both a living and a lived body, and he tried to explore it from both angles. Okay, now I would like to say a few words about his work on the living body, so how he construed the living body, and I will just touch upon the surface of the surface, just the crucial parts. This type of exploration is, of course, related to Francisco's work in biology and cognitive science. But what is crucial for our presentation is that in his later years, he conceived of organism as an ongoing dialectics, as an ongoing circularity, as an ongoing back and forth between two processes. On the one hand, we have the circular process, which establishes the identity of the organism. This is something that is related to his work on autonomy and autopoiesis, the famous idea where parts constitute the whole, whereby the whole enables the parts to constitute the whole, okay? However, this goes hand in hand with another circular process, which is the process of the organism establishing a stable, synchronous relationship with its environment. And this is something that Francisco was developing in the context of enaction and sense making. So once this unity gets constituted, its relations to its environment are meaningful because it matters to this organism to maintain its unity. Now, what is crucial is that these two aspects, identity and cognition, co-specify and co-determine each other. So they co-specify each other. They have to be understood dynamically and dialectically. What I mean by that is that as soon as the organism establishes its autonomous identity, it spills out into its environment, carving out a distinct domain of significance for it. And it is this domain of significance, this distinct milieu or Umwelt, as it's sometimes called, that allows the organism to establish and maintain its autonomy. So we have this back and forth between these two dimensions. Francisco's work on the lived body is related to his later work in the fields of phenomenology and first-person experience research. Unfortunately, this work is considerably less well known, and due to his premature death, it is also much more fragmentary. However, we have enough fragments available to see that towards the end of his life, he was developing the idea of the lived body that had a surprisingly similar dynamics. So, with regards to the lived body, the body as I live it in my own experience, yeah, that I live through, so to speak, I also find the dialectics of two processes. Our lived body is on the one hand recessive. It pertains to my corporeal depths. It is my body, my anchorage, my point of entry into the world. It is the place, or better yet, a vehicle of my fundamental existential rhythms. Rhythms such as breathing, digestion, proprioception, affect, and so on and so forth. However, this same body is also ecstatic. It is thrown outside of itself. It is thrown into the world. It is lost in and propped up by the world. It loses itself in the rhythms of the world and acquires its sustenance from it. The social, cultural, technological, and so on frameworks it is embedded in importantly specify who and how I am. They importantly delineate what my body will be like. And what is very telling here is Francisco's own account with his Francisco's account of his own experience with liver transplant, where he really become embedded in this framework of various technologies that allowed him to undergo the whole procedure. So again, what we have is a co-specification between two dimensions, recessive and ecstatic. Now, even if you weren't able to follow all the minutiae that I've been talking about here, the crucial point that I would like to draw your attention to is that in both cases, we have this interesting dynamics when it comes to life. Namely, we have two movements, movement inward and movement outward, simultaneously co-determining, co-specifying each other. In other words, a living being to be centered has to decenter itself. However, by decentering itself, it precisely becomes centered. Now, why is this important? Because life then is neither pure interiority, it is not an inside without an outside or a subject, nor is it pure exteriority. It is not an outside without an inside, which is the definition of the object. So we have an interesting phenomenon which also which undergoes some sort of a breathing pattern almost, where it goes outside to become inside, and when it's inside, it has to go outside. Okay, so this in turn allows us for a more close-knit conception of the relationship between being and knowing, one that is closer to what Francisco was aiming at with his participatory epistemology. I said then that this is precisely what he was interested in, that he wanted to find a closer interconnection, interpenetration between being and knowing. And we have seen that a living being, to be itself, to be able to maintain its internality, has to actualize, that is to say, externalize itself. We might say that it has to go outside of itself, to find its way back to itself. Now, in the case of human beings, what this concretely means is that the innermost impetus of our existence strives towards externalization, towards situatedness, towards contextualization. You know, by living, we contextualize, by living, we enframe. In other words, the vital strives towards the cognitive, towards the symbolic. For it is in symbolic that it acquires its temporary completion, its temporary actualization. In other words, there is no vital text without cognitive context. Life as such always contextualizes. And Francisco wanted to explore precisely this ongoing dynamism rigorously, the one that I've now fleshed out very briefly and probably somewhat cumbersomely, because I'm pretty sure that many of you have started drifting off. What he was especially interested in, however, is what happens in that particular moment of decontextualization in between two contexts. So when you're in one context and then what happens is a shift into another one. So I would like to close my presentation with just 2 more slides on this particular topic. Francisco wanted to explore this particular dynamics that I've just described of life and how it relates, how it is given both as experience and both as something that is given to me as an object or a pattern or a form in the world, and this ongoing fluctuation between going inward and outward in at least two interrelated ways. On the one hand, he wanted to develop something that might be called a reflexive science. Reflexive science is something that is probably known to you from the embodied mind. It is a science that takes into account its experiential roots. Okay? The crucial thing here would be to establish an ongoing dialogue, an ongoing back and forth between the study of experience, which would be done through phenomenology and contemplative science, and scientific inquiry, which would be done, say, through biology and cognitive science, and to see how scientific inquiry emerges from the dynamics of lived experience and how lived experience is then informed by scientific inquiry. However, there's another aspect to this, perhaps more general and more personal, but less well known. Francisco basically wanted to find a different mode of reflection, a different mode of contemplation, what I here to refer as uroboric thought. So it is a mode of reflection that takes into account its origins, its vital depths. It is a type of reflection that does not forget its own corporeality, its own vitality. This basically means that this type of reflection, this type of contemplation would have to do with contemplating the awareness of how we become centered in a given framework and then observe how the process of decentering happens, how you slide or slip out of this particular context, and try to attend to and understand what happens in this process. So in a certain sense, it means being present at the birth of the world and the self, so to speak. Okay, so we have now reached the end of my talk, finally, for some probably. The end, however, which is also, in a certain sense, the beginning. We have seen that, like the mythological snake Ouroboros, life constantly tries to grasp and devour itself. Yet it is always one step removed from actually being able to do so. And in a certain sense, something similar could be said of this talk. I have opened my talk with my personal story, which I hope has helped us encounter one aspect of Francisco's thought that is usually neglected and overlooked. And if we were now to go back to the beginning, we would see that the path we have traversed, so all these stories about contexts and decontextualizations and recontextualizations, would shed fresh light on my own original story, thereby, in a sense, changing the very path we have traversed. The same, in fact, has been true of all my engagements with Francisco, for these have consisted of a series of ongoing dialogues, ongoing back and forths, where every step towards elucidation would raise new questions, open up new depths, and lead to new articulations, and so on and so forth. For this reason, the title Intimate Distances seemed particularly fitting for my talk. As many of you know, I have borrowed it from the essay which Francisco wrote near the end of his life, and in which he recounts his experience with his liver transplant. The phrase refers to that peculiar phenomenon we have met with several times during our explorations, the phenomenon of being connected through separation or coinciding but at a remove. It therefore very neatly captures the ambivalent fact that through my ongoing engagement with his work, Francisco became someone whom I feel closely connected to, not just intellectually, but existentially, even personally, and someone who, at least fragmentarily, lives on through my thoughts and works. And yet, despite having read most, if not everything he has ever published, and having plunged into the very depths of his ideational world, he is someone who will, due to his premature death, remain forever and in principle distant, unreachable. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Sebastjan. I think we're all applauding you. I'm not sure if you can see, but you have gallery view.
Thanks for everyone who has stayed to the very end. Valiant warriors.
You've taken us through a lot of territory.
I know.
And I think really enacted what you set out to illustrate, which is this sort of suturing together or this interpenetration of the epistemic and the existential. So thank you for letting us in a little bit on your experience and then your encounter with Francisco's work, and then also your understanding really of the development of his work. So we have a good 25 minutes for discussion, and this can be a really informal discussion. So if you'd like to engage with the material with Seb, just raise your hand or open your mic, and we can start the discussion. And if you can't open your mic, or if you wouldn't like to, you can also just drop your comment in the chat, and we can always read that out for you. So. And maybe while we're waiting, I know that this is a lot to take in, so people are probably, their questions are maybe still percolating. Hopefully they'll come to the surface. I wanted to ask you about actually this major puzzle piece, which you didn't mention in your presentation. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, because we often hear a lot about Francisco's engagement with Buddhist epistemologies, precisely for some of the same reasons that you cite, the tradition of phenomenology and this certain traditions of thinking which put circularity really at their center. And I was sort of surprised not to see that piece evoked, at least in his intellectual trajectory as you relate to it. So I'm just wondering, how do you relate to that aspect of his I would say, existential hyphen intellectual evolution?
Yeah, that's a good point, or a good question. Basically, when I was talking about this last aspect, which I refer to as contextualization or decontextualization, which very briefly is just trying to find means that would allow you to thematize and reflect upon and understand how the process of the genesis of context happens. This is something that was, for Francisco, very intimately connected to his Buddhist practice. So he saw in the contemplative, meditative methods that he has been taught within the Tibetan tradition, mostly, precisely that, working with, let's say, working with the capacity to stand at the origin of the worlds, to put it dramatically, which basically means precisely that, being present in the rhythms of the emerging of a context and then shifting of a context, and being able to capture that in-between phase between one context and the other one. What happens there? It is a phase that usually we go through very quickly. But the idea is, can you anchor yourself there and pause there and actually observe the dynamics of this in-betweenness? So this is what I was referring to the last step as contextualizing or decontextualizing, because it's precisely being able to acquire an insight of the dynamics of this. And it's not, it can be an intellectual inquiry, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't be. In fact, I think that, you know, the two, as I've pointed out, are very, very closely interrelated, but it is something that is existentially pertinent for every one of us in one way or another. So for me personally, it became pertinent during that particular experience that I've recounted at the beginning of the talk. For Francisco, it became very, very clearly and viscerally pertinent during the experience of the Civil War. And there are different, of course, things that happen in our life that show how important this is. So those are usually those awakenings that happen when something very dire happens in your life. And you know, what is dire or extreme might differ from one person to another, but it's precisely something that throws you out of the usual trajectory and shows you that prior to that you were embodying a given context, that you were living within a certain framework that made all of this that you take for granted meaningful, and that it's not trivial, it's not self-evident that, you know, this is the only way how things can be structured and patterned. So yes, the Buddhist tradition in this regard was very interesting for him because it allowed him to work on this hands-on, so to speak. It gave him the tools. He would constantly emphasize that, and he was, even for example, in the text where he was talking about the phenomenology of shunyata, when he was trying to provide the phenomenology of the experience of nothingness, sorry, of emptiness, he was constantly emphasizing, I don't want to slip into the Buddhist idiom. So for him, this was a very, very useful temporary framework to inhabit, which gave him the tools to, in a certain sense, deframe itself eventually. But he didn't see it as the only way of making sense of this or the only set of tools that could be used to achieve this.
Yeah, thank you for putting that in the context. Yeah, it wasn't an exceptionalist or exceptionalizing move by any
No,
means.
I understood that. Yeah, no problem.
So the floor is open, so feel free if you have comments or reflections or.
I will try to. Thank you very much for your talk. It's very, very nice to hear all the road that you had traversed. I will try to explain a little bit some doubts and some ideas that come out because of my encounter with the work, not only of Varela, but everything that is going on here is coming from the Latin American philosophy, specifically from liberation philosophy, which in which I found a couple of few decades ago. I find references. I don't know if you know. Liberation philosophy, Latin American liberation philosophy, is an ethical stand, a political stand that is based on the idea of life as the source of all ethical normativity. You know, so in this case, not many people knows, but one of the most important references is Varela. You know, but is misquoted in one of the most important texts of Enrique Dussel, and so many people doesn't know that he's talking about, for example, autopoiesis, but he's talking about specifically about the works of Varela. No? But of course, there is something, you know, in your presentation and in general, you know, that I find difficult with difficulties is that I mean, there is let's go to your presentation to the point you started with the Chilean coup d'etat. I read the text, and one of my first impressions, first of all, is an early text of Varela, so I don't take at face value that he will stand with that perspective in the last period of his life. But one of the things that I find very interesting about this text is that there is a kind of decontextualization of what happened there. I mean, the Chilean coup d'etat, it was not something that happened in Chile. It was something that was a global phenomenon, especially I am Latin American, and we live that situation from Mexico to Tierra del Fuego. No? It was a geopolitical project. And in that experience, there were two sides that they were confronted with two very different epistemologies that you can explain quite easily, because the texts of those who inspire one and the other one, they have explicit texts talking about their own epistemologies. For example, Hayek in one case, or in the other case, all the Marxist tradition. But there were also another character there. They were the victims of the coup d'etat. They were outside of the framework of this one-to-one. Somebody was out in the exteriority of any totality that has been created by these two combatants. And what I miss always is a treatment, a reflection about this exteriority, that thing that, you're talking one moment going from one context to another, just like in the Bardo tradition, in the Buddhist tradition, and finding this moment of sudden awakening in which you realize that you are just embedded in one epistemological framework, and then you realize that things could be seen in another way. But one of the things that is different in Latin American liberation philosophy is the importance, you talked about the other day about that, the importance of taking into account the breakthrough that happens when something that cannot be reduced to your own perspective come in, which is the other that breaks the illusion, and breaks the illusion without being able, from our side, to take over the experience, for example, the experience of suffering of somebody else. And so I wanted to know, because I listened to you a couple of times, you talk about the alternatives for this problem in Whitehead and Hegel. And in liberation philosophy, there are other authors that are used in order just to think about not only the changes in our perspective, in the line of our experience of different contexts we are awakening that you are explaining before, but also these breaks that happen when we encounter somebody that is explaining or is showing or is expressing something that we cannot really understand, or we can really don't, we are not able to touch. We cannot, when you see somebody dying, when somebody said to you, I am in pain, something is broken in our understanding. And it's coming from outside, completely outside to us. And so in liberation philosophy, the authors we use are different. They are Marx, basically, and Levinas, two authors that talk about the phenomenon of life in a substantive way. So I wanted to know if there is some reflection within this tradition that is focused on these particular authors and this particular topic. The topic is no one, no two, but there is something even there that is beyond our intent of, fixing our epistemological stand again. I don't know if I make it clear, probably not.
Yes,
I just trying to working out what my experience of your talk.
Oh yes. So yeah, thanks for the comment. In the Tree of Knowledge, the last chapter, the authors talk about the importance of these breakdowns and disruptions and things that I've been talking about here from a slightly different angle. And one of the, if I remember correctly, they enumerate at least three possible catalysts of this. One is reflection, which is in a certain sense the guiding light throughout the whole book. So they focus mostly on this reflective movement. The second one is the encounter with the other. The encounter with the other. So precisely what you were saying now. And the third one is, I never particularly like this one, unless it's severely qualified. And if it's qualified, then it's really good, which is usually the case with the most important stuff in life. Love. So yes, there definitely is that. There definitely is this particular moment. And I would say, you know, when I was mentioning at some point in my meandering talk, these various ways in which this decentering can happen, and that it can occur in different circumstances and so on and so forth. And one of the more pregnant, one of the stronger ones are precisely the ones that you mentioned. So seeing someone in pain or someone dying, someone profoundly suffering. But from what I can see, you know, this is precisely an intrusion into your own, let's say, framework, which breaks it apart in a certain important sense. It can happen in different ways. I don't see in which regard this particular something would be, because when I was referring to my own experience, I said this, I mentioned this recognition of how futile and impotent, in a certain sense, the means I had at my disposal were when they came face to face with what I called like the in your face, raw presence of, let's say, brute reality. Yeah. And this is also a certain eruption of the real, being face to face with the other in a way that is not pre-specified or predetermined by your own previous modes of handling people and seeing them. And I think that what happened to Francisco was precisely that, because usually the way you think about it, even in what you were saying, is me, them. And once you get beyond this, you still have someone outside. But the idea was that for him at that particular moment, at least that's how I see it, he had this experience, but this in a certain sense fell apart. So it was a Buberian moment, the capacity to see the other. He specifically talks about this boy that he sees, a young boy, and if you've read the paper, probably it stayed with you, that he saw killing someone, shooting someone. And he says, if I saw this boy just, you know, a couple of weeks prior to this, it would be just another jolly young fellow out with his friends. But now there he was. I saw him shoot another person, kill another person. And then this was devastating to him. But then when he had this particular experience where the things fell apart, he saw this boy not on the other side of the fence, but as his brother. This is something tremendously powerful. I don't think I'm capable of being able to do full justice to this. Yeah. And I know what the pitfalls are also of this type of talking. I know all the pitfalls about, say, the non-duality as the cornerstone of ethics and all the problems with that. So that's also partly the reason why I didn't go into this. Maybe specific experiences, even if they might be, let's say, dynamically or structurally similar to experiences of someone else, by happening in a specific context or in a specific way, give a certain nuance to them, a certain, let's say, directionality, and you then emphasize certain things more than the others. To give you a concrete example, that is why, for instance, I feel way more drawn, speaking of the authors from the Latin American context, to Gasset, than, for example, certain other authors, who has this emphasis on the mindness of life and also the impact that he had on the Chilean philosophy, for instance. Yeah? So maybe this is because of the experience that I had, and that is profoundly meaningful to me, and that it's still, in a certain sense, the impetus that drives also my epistemological inquiries. Maybe because it happened the way it happened, Levinas never spoke to me, but Heidegger did. And you see, to me, the questions about who's on the right spectrum of politically, when it comes to this, doesn't really matter. It does, I know, ultimately it does. Don't get me wrong, don't get me wrong. I'm talking now about a different dimension, yeah? On the level of what it is that speaks to you. So I would just end this with this idea that I would say that, you know, throughout the text you find this element. Why it wasn't emphasized to the degree that it wasn't, I don't know. I do think, however, that it could be integrated in this particular story or what I was trying to flesh out.
Let me just, I think that you can integrate it for sure. No, I'm not, I was not thinking about in a critical manner. Only that, you know, epistemology matters, and epistemology matters in different dimensions. And one of the dimensions is that different epistemological frameworks allows us to do certain things, and certain epistemological frameworks do not allow us to do certain things. For example, in the political, if you are in a political framework, certain epistemological frameworks do have the possibility to reduce or minimize sufferings, while other frameworks do not take even into account the suffering of others. So it's not just about our particular personal, you know, feelings. It's about to get the right epistemological framework. And I was surprised and very, very glad your presentation is just this idea. No, he found himself in a moment in history in which one epistemological framework he recognized profoundly mistaken. So my only point is just to re-emphasize what you said, and adding that there is one dimension, which is exteriority, in the sense that not only you encounter something, a naked reality, you encounter somebody that you do not have access to him or to her, who speak to you and said to you, I am suffering. You cannot see it. It's like science. You cannot see his suffering. You cannot touch it. But his voice get through the veil of your, you know, closed, you know, perception, and maybe you can hear it. And so you need another epistemology to see what is not seen in the human realm as well. You know what I mean? I don't know if I make myself understand. You know
Yes,
what I
I
mean?
do. Just a very brief comment with regards to one thing. I think that for me personally, one of the biggest insights in this thing that Varela mentioned, and especially in light of what we're witnessing now, which is structurally very similar to what he's describing, this growing polarization, is the incapacity of both sides to integrate this insight that was central for Varela, namely the realization that I myself might be contributing to what's going on, and the capacity to pull the rug under my feet. Because what you said, in a certain sense, I agree. There are epistemologies that on the surface level would seem to be incompatible with grave injustices. But even superficial glimpse at history shows you how wrong this can be. So, you know, it again depends on which level we're talking about. There is, I know what you mean, and I know what you would like to say, but for me, the most important thing is still, there is no getting away from a certain engagement with the fact, or the certain recognition of the fact that what you think is like truly the right, the compassionate approach might be something that's feeding the whole movement on and on and on. Now, this is the problematic aspect. And both sides are unwilling to accept that. And as
Oh,
long as this happens, the movement is going on.
Yes, but for this, I'm saying you're not talking about two epistemologies that are encountering each other. I mean, it's very much in the same line, you know, but the only difference is that somebody that is not in the framework of defending a position always becomes a victim. The victims are historically is like that. You know, if you think about the Tibetans, you think of the Soviets, you think about the indigenous people, always there is somebody that is not involved in the confrontation. And somebody is outside and is the invisible one. Is the one that is not, nobody take care simply because it does not exist, because it's an exteriority of the conflict. It's somebody that is doesn't count, it's not in the equation. And so for this reason, you know, both parties that are confronting to each other, they take for granted that what they see is the total history of the conflict. But there is something outside. But we can say the same if you talk about our scientific knowledge and our scientific approach and our contemplative approach. Because I mean, I come from Buddhism as well. I was a monk, but now I dedicate myself to political philosophy and ethics and sociology. And one of the surprising things is the vision of the Mahayana. The Mahayana, you know, you have in the Mahayana there is this eruption taking place. You know, it's not only that, you know, there is always a constant tension between, you know, the contemplative vision that we have in our meditation and the fact that until, I mean, in the scripture, until enlightenment, you know, take place, you know, you cannot solve a problem. That appearances do still have a power of them for themselves, and they speak to you, and you have to take into account that. And so in this Chilean text, you know, that is a fantastic text actually, and it's very close to me. I was a journalist at that time, a photographer and quite all, and I was covering, you know, the plebiscite in Chile in 1988, and I was very close to people that was exiled for many years, you know, in Chile. And one of the things that the most important thing for me was all these young people, you know, that they didn't know anything about the, you know, of the coup d'etat, but they were the victims of those fights, those struggles. And well, how we deal with the reality of those who are outside our circle. This is my you know, passion, I would say.
Okay, I understand you now better. I will not go into this because I think Gabro wants to open up the floor for another.
Sorry.
But I think I know what you now mean with this excluded something. So thanks for clarifying this. At first I misunderstood, but yeah, okay.
Thank you. So we're at about time. I just want to make sure if there's any other questions in the room that weren't able to get articulated. We just have, let's say, 5 more minutes, if that's okay with you, Seb, to go over just
for sure. Yeah.
I realize we have a room full of people who've worked on and even worked with Varela, and so if anyone wants to jump in. And also I want to acknowledge a comment that Bruce had made earlier. He was citing, in defense of love, as he put it, he was citing the Vedanta concept of Satchitananda. So you can also read that in the chat. I'm not sure if there was a question there, but there was just some additional comments, and there's another comment as well. So Wolfgang, did you want to?
Anybody else?
Yeah, just really succinct. We've just got a few minutes left. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I could try. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but I was struck also by this. Well, thank you very much for the wonderful and rich presentation. Very more than thought-provoking, for sure. And I noticed also already during your talk when you were referring to this description of the polarization, the times of polarization around the coup d'etat in sort of the earlier parts of your telling of the life path and development of Francisco Varela. And I thought somehow, yeah, in some way we live in a similar time. I mean, you would find these kinds of statements of A is like the worst person or is the king of the world. Each of us could probably immediately pull several sort of very popular individuals, politicians and whatnot, who would fit such a description. Or so the times are somehow ripe in a similar way for but I wonder for what. So here I'm not really sure how to phrase the question. I was struck by the similarity on one hand, and it seemed to me that there is some connection between this and then the move to what you described with the recognizing context and and decontextualization as a kind of I don't know exactly how to nail this. That rather than thinking, oh, is A right or is B right, or is maybe, oh, maybe it's a synthesis between A and B, there's something in beginning to understand through some other modality of relating to experience, maybe through contemplative practice of some sort. Oh, this is how these viewpoints arise and pass. This is how I could shift into the one or the other, or I could find myself unable to shift into the one or the other, or I can do it, but I experience profound discomfort or whatever. But there's something beyond the mirrors or the screens that we could choose as our favorite screens, narratives, stories, worldviews, in how these things are being constructed and deconstructed, and something to practice around this. But I don't know, I feel some excitement around this. I don't know exactly where to go with it, but maybe you can do something with it. So I pass the ball or the baton to you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so right, Seb is going to solve the current geopolitical problem in 3 minutes, for sure. No, just maybe one thought with regards to this is I think that the contemplative aspect would definitely be one aspect, but I think that in this particular regard, I think that at some point the recognition, so let's say I'm going to speak now from the Varelian position, but it might turn out that this is in many ways a naive position, an untenable position. So maybe even he himself would agree at some point that this might be the case. But if what was being proposed in what I said were to somehow be actualized or attempted to be put into practice, the biggest challenge would be to be able to see what the process is within which these two polar opposites move. So what is it that binds them, even though they might seem as if they're polarly opposed? So it's in a certain sense, it's an old philosophical trick, you might say. Yeah, you find it in many different authors. But it's an old trick and an easy trick only when you read about it in a textbook. When you find yourself in a concrete situation, when you have to solve the problem, then it's really, really difficult, because nobody is going to do it for you. If anything, people are going to scream in your face from both sides, and you're likely to find yourself drift one way or another, and you're fed up with stuff, and you're just like, no, they are crazy. I can't. Yeah. But so this would be this particular part of the project. Now, it's tremendously difficult because one accumulates and doesn't even know, like, a lot of forces that shape you in a very specific way and pull you into a certain direction. And as long as there is a certain stability in the society, these do not necessarily even matter. You kind of we spread out through the whole field, the temporal and spatial field. But once this polarization happens, then you find yourself in a certain current, and almost like you're drawn to one side. And it's, again, on pen and paper, when we have these talks, when we write stuff and we read it in text, it's easy to say it, but it's so freaking difficult when this is happening. And then you have to really, really work on that, because the biggest challenge is really, really finding a way to challenge your own sedimented, strong beliefs and allow yourself space. And this is really, really difficult sometimes to see in what way they might necessarily not be true in all contexts. And from this, what could happen, not necessarily that you have to undergo a complete shift, a complete reversal in the proclivities or the tendency that you have. From what I know, and maybe Amy can say something with this, Varela never let go of his leftist leanings, but he was very much sobered by the experience. So it left a profound mark, and also the way he related to this, for instance. But what could happen is something that's been completely lost now, that little room that might then perhaps spread out, which would allow for a meaningful conversation. Because if I do allow this possibility that there are certain aspects of my view that I simply cannot or must not viscerally respond to, that's the only way for me to be even grasp the possibility of hearing and understanding the other person. So it's a very unfortunately schematic answer. I'm not really sure that I have given any good bullet points, but it's also something that for me personally was an important part of how I position myself with regards to all of this. So yeah, that's a very inadequate answer, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much. I found it fantastic. Yeah, so anyway, I'll give the space to other people, but you triggered some further thoughts and insights immediately while you were speaking. So thank you very much.
Thank you for being so kind about this fragmentary response.
Thanks, Wolfgang. Thanks, Sebastjan. And I just proposed to Bruce, maybe you can continue the exchange over email, because he made a few actually longer comments in the chat. So we can certainly save the chat, send that to you, and then maybe put you in touch over email. That might be an easier way of continuing the conversation, because it looks like we're going to have to close. So this could, I feel like this could go on certainly for a lot longer. We just sort of scratched the surface, as is usually the case with these talks. But Seb, would you like to offer any final word before we close the evening, or do you feel satisfied?
Well, so I would just like to thank everybody who has managed to muster and muscle through the whole talk. I know that the second part became quite dense at some points. So it was a great pleasure to be able to share some of these ideas. They are, as you've seen, still in the process of gaining the final form and shape. And yeah, I really do hope that I would have had that I could have provided a better answer to Wolfgang's question. So maybe my appeal for the next year is to reflect on this, and for all of us to reflect on this and maybe try to figure out something along those lines. I don't know.
We'll certainly be able to continue the conversation, I think, in some way, and over the next year or two. So thank you everyone this evening for joining us, and also for all of your presence and your questions. And thank you especially to you, Seb, for this really deep dive into Varela's work and
Okay.
also your own. So thank you so much. And as we mentioned in the beginning, this was our last online talk of the year. So we don't have an end slide to present the next event coming up, but we would just like to wish you all a really peaceful as possible holiday season, and a really nice start to 2024, wherever you find yourselves. So thank you once again to everyone who's joined us, and have a really nice evening or rest of the day, wherever you find yourself.
Thank you very much. Yeah, be well, everyone.
Thanks, Sebastjan. Thank you, Johanna.
Thank you.
Thank you.